Hey, how are you today? This is Josh Patrick, and you're at Cracking the Cash Flow Code. And my guest today is a very special guest, and I'm really serious this time. Really is a very special guest. He's an important person in my life because he was my editor at the New York Times. And when he got me, I was probably this side of terrible as a writer. And when that section of Times finally closed down, I made it all the way up to mediocre as a writer. And I credit this guy, his name is Loren Feldman, as being one of my best writing coaches of all time. So we're not going to talk about my ability as a writer or lack of ability as a writer. We're going to talk about what he's learned from working at the New York Times and as an editor at Forbes and an editor at Inc. And he has now started his own thing. And we're going to hear about what's the difference between writing about entrepreneurship to actually living it. So instead of me yammering on, which I have a bad habit of doing, let's bring Loren on. Hey, Loren, how are you today?
Great, Josh. Great to be here. Thanks so much for having me.
Oh, it's my pleasure. And you really have been a huge help in my journey as becoming a reasonable writer.
Well, you're being too hard on yourself, but you're making my day. If I helped you at all, I feel great about that.
You helped me a tremendous amount. So I have a question. I mean, here's my first question, Lauren. What are some of the biggest lessons you learned while you were an editor for those three, business publications?
Um, well, I know where you're going with this, and let me give you an example of. Let me just say this, and maybe you've learned this yourself at various points. It's a lot easier to tell other people how to run their businesses than it is to run your own business. So, one of the things I learned as an editor, to answer your question, is that a tremendous percentage of business owners are nervous about charging as much as they should charge for whatever their product is or whatever their service is. I've talked to so many people in so many situations, and I learned a long time ago that if you're looking at why a business is struggling, that's a good place to start to check and see, are they charging enough? Because people tend to get gun shy, they get nervous about it. And I've parroted that advice, not because I'd lived it or because I had any particular expertise, but because I talked to a lot of smart people who had shown me that to be true. Then I got to the point where I had to price my own stuff, and we can talk about that whenever you're ready. And it's a very different ball game.
Yeah, well, I tell people all the time that there's likely way more pricing elasticity in their business than they think. Now, when I was in the food service and vending business, we had a lot of pricing elasticity around our catering. We had none in the vending business because it was so ridiculously brutal and competitive. But for the most part, you're absolutely correct. If you're in the advice business, for example, I could almost promise you that you're underpricing by 20 to 50%. If you're in the construction business, you're underpricing. If you're not hearing no at least 20% of the time, I really think you're too cheap. Does that make sense?
It does. It does. And, it comes up in all sorts of situations. I mean, it tends to come up whenever there's a conversation about the minimum wage being increased. And, owners tend to be nervous about even the slightest increase in their prices, even if it's, to pay people to meet the new minimum wage law. When it's your business, though, it's hard because everybody has that fear in their gut. There is a line somewhere. Am I close to it? I don't know for sure, but I do know I don't want to go over that line and have people have my phone stop ringing or people stop coming into my place.
Well, as I tell people, it's easier to lower prices and raise prices. So if you start with your prices high, you can always give people a discount. If you start with your prices low and you go back and say, I want to give you a price increase, then you have a challenge. So my advice is start with your prices high. If you're not hearing yes, keep them high, but offer a discount.
But there's a psychological aspect to this as well. And I think, you started by asking me, what I've learned covering entrepreneurship. Another thing I've learned is that people go into business generally because they really know something about something. They have some area of expertise, and they're really good at it, or they wouldn't, have the nerve to try to turn it into a business. But nobody knows all the things you need to know to run a business, and it's just hard to develop the professional skills to do all the things that you need to do to run a business beyond those that you bring to the table initially. And I think pricing is a part of that.
Yeah, my experience is business owners really don't become any good at what they do till they're out 50.
Well, it depends on
there's
when
a
they start.
Well, that's even if they start
For
after
those of us who
50,
start past 50, that's
well, it's
that's
a
not
different ball
helpful.
game, but you've learned a lot along the way. And I can tell from my own personal experience, in my 20s and 30s, I was a disaster as a business owner. I was a disaster because I was a terrible human being being a business owner. And I was a disaster because I didn't know anything and I thought I did.
You wrote
And
about that
over
for
the
me at the New
years,
York Times. You wrote some terrific pieces about it.
yeah,
And I think
yeah.
that probably helped a lot of people because you're not alone in feeling that way.
Well, I know for a fact that's what the world is. And the reason people at 50 start becoming successful and making some money is they've stopped making the mistakes they made that hurt them along the way. And they've learned from their mistakes. In fact, I wrote that in my newsletter today that's going out tomorrow. I was writing about the concept of mistakes and the fact we need to learn how to embrace mistakes to be successful in anything we do.
The thing is, it's so interesting. In a lot of walks of life, there is tremendous opportunity to learn before you do. You don't just get sent out there to figure it out yourself. But that happens a lot with business ownership. I mean, I think entrepreneurial MBA programs have gotten better, but I think you probably would agree with me. There's nothing that really prepares you to run a business except running a business, and that's why you're in that position of having to learn from your mistakes.
Yeah, one of my one of my sort of mantras is the most dangerous degree granted in the United States is the MBA, especially for small businesses.
Right.
I've yet to see an MBA program, including the entrepreneurial programs, that really get at the issues that a smaller privately held business owner has. And by that, I mean businesses with less than 50 employees. MBA programs are okay to mediocre for over that. And they're probably pretty good for over 1,000 employees. I've never worked in a big organization, so I can't say that for a fact, but I can say the MBAs we hired, we had to deprogram before they became useful for a smart company.
I'm not surprised to hear that. I mean, the other thing is they tend to focus on building venture-backed businesses, and that's a tiny percentage of the businesses that get started, and not my particular not my favorite model anyway, even if you're able to attract venture capital. But that's an issue as well, because I think that's the focus of most MBA programs if they deal with entrepreneurship at all.
Well, that's my, I've been saying for years, the VC model is a really dangerous business model. You either become a unicorn or you're sold off to one of the big ones because they want your talent. The VCs do
in the
not
best
care.
case scenario.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, worst case scenario, you're going to, if you've got talent and you've been VC backed, you're going to find yourself a good home when your business crashes and burns and you have no more money.
But you know what I think people don't think about enough, Josh? A lot of those businesses that crash and burn didn't have to crash and burn, and that they crash and burn because of the VC model, which destroys more businesses than it creates, because their whole goal is, as you know, you have to become a unicorn, as you just said. Their whole goal is to build these businesses as big as possible. So they throw more money at you than you really need, and they tell you to go for broke. And a lot of them end up broke because they have to meet the needs of the VCs. Whereas if they didn't take all that money and they just tried to build a sustainable business, they might have succeeded and built a really good business. And that's the shame of it. Those businesses never get built.
Oh, I've been preaching that for years, as you know. And the thing that people don't realize is that when you take VC money, you're focusing on the wrong end of the P&L, meaning that you're focusing on the top line. And I think I wrote a post about this. My father and I used to have this ongoing argument. It went for years and years and years.
I remember
And he
this.
would say, "You're an idiot. You don't focus on profits." And I said, "No, we need to grow the business. We need to focus on top line." Well, I focus on top line, flat ran out of cash, and then learned that, yeah, maybe I should pay attention to the bottom line.
Maybe your father did know something.
He knew that thing he knew about. That he was right on the money about. And I was completely wrong about it. So,
Well, you're not alone.
no, I'm not. I'm not. And that's the unfortunate thing about VCs. So, Loren, when you were an editor, you got to hear lots and lots and lots of stories. What was some of the more interesting ones you've heard?
Oh gosh, it's it's hard to pick one or two. Um, when I was at Forbes, I started a program we did there called Forbes Small Giants. We partnered with the Small Giants organization, which actually grew out of a book written by a colleague of mine when I was at Inc., a guy named Bo Burlingham. And he wrote about businesses that are the antithesis of the VC-backed firms we're talking about, firms that decide they want to be great, not necessarily big. It doesn't mean they're against growth. They're not against growth at all. They just want to grow on their own terms. And that means, maybe they're bootstrapped, or if they take some friends and family or investment money, it's under control. They control the business. So he wrote that book, I guess, around 2005. And about, I don't know, 5 or 6 years ago, we started this program where we picked a new cohort of Forbes Small Giants every year. And we just found some amazing companies that were doing really cool things. There was an advertising business in Toronto called Zulu Alpha Kilo. It was started by a guy who was a refugee. His name was Zach, Z-A-K. So the initials of Zulu Alpha Kilo matched his name. He was a refugee. That's the wrong word. He worked at a very big, successful advertising business, but thought there was a better way to do it, started his own firm. And one of the things he quickly decided to do was he was going to stop doing those pitches that advertising agencies are generally forced to do, where they donate their time to try to win an account. They participate in a contest with other agencies, give away their best thoughts, and sometimes get the business, but often don't. And he said, you know what? I'm not doing that anymore. I am, if you want to hire us, hire us. If not, don't. And his business didn't grow as fast as some others, but it grew, and he got great accounts, and people respected what he was doing. And that was kind of the type of business we were looking for. Somebody who was willing to buck the trends in their industry and do things the way they thought should be done.
That's great to hear. So, Loren, you have your own venture you're doing now. How's the difference for you going from being a great editor to joining the world of entrepreneurship?
Well, that's nice of you to put it that way. It's a pretty big difference, especially when it comes to the paycheck. I'm just getting started. As you know, I've kind of been on my own for about 3 years now, but I've really been on my own for the last 1 year. And this happened because I'd had great experiences at Inc., at Forbes, and at the New York Times. But at each place, they had their own ideas about what they thought was useful in terms of covering entrepreneurs and business owners. For example, at Forbes, and I happen to disagree, but they're very smart people, and they weren't wrong. They were probably right for their brand, but they do tend to focus on the VC-backed model. They were less interested in what I was trying to do. They weren't that excited about the Forbes Small Giants idea. But my point to you is, at each of these places, I learned a lot, but could never quite bring it all together in one place because it didn't quite make sense to fit within the guidelines of the mission of that particular organization. So in 2018, I met someone who had kind of similar ideas, and we decided to partner and build the content community platform for business owners that I thought was there to be built and that nobody else was doing. We ran into some, ups and downs. His businesses actually struggled a little bit. It was kind of my idea and his money. His business started to struggle a little bit before the pandemic, and then really had some issues when the pandemic hit. And at that point, he felt he needed to focus on his core business, and we went our separate ways as friends. He was very generous about it. He gave me the things we had built so far. That included a daily email newsletter in which I highlight some of the content that I create, but also bring together, aggregate the most important stories of the day that I can find specifically for business owners. And I try to pull out whatever is most important for a business owner and put that in the newsletter. The notion being that while a lot of this stuff is available, that people could find it on their own, I find it for them, put it all in one place, and deliver it to their inbox. So I do that. And I also have a podcast that we started, and that I think has really worked out great. I don't think there's anything else quite like it. I started following the journeys of 7, now 8 business owners in weekly conversations that started just before the pandemic. Obviously, we had no idea it was coming when we started, but it really kind of made this idea because their stories, I talked to them 3 of them every week. Their stories became pretty dramatic once the pandemic hit. A couple of them were not at all sure they were going to survive. A couple of them did okay. And a couple of them did way better than they would have without the pandemic. So it was a real interesting mix. And we would gather every week for an hour and talk about what they were experiencing. And some of it got, really intense and really emotional. And I think a lot of our listeners have really gotten invested in, whether these businesses are going to survive and thrive or not. So I got that. I got a lot of work to do, but that's what I'm focusing on right now. The good news is I get a lot of great feedback. The bad news is I haven't quite figured out how to monetize it yet, but I'm working on it.
Yeah, that sort of is a challenge with all this online stuff. There's some great content, great stuff out there. And it's sort of a chicken and the egg. It's hard to monetize until you get traffic. It's
Yes.
hard to get traffic until you monetize.
It's really difficult. I was at the New York Times when the Times was thinking about putting up its paywall, and they struggled with it. They had, I think they had 30 million readers a month, and it was hard for them to do. So you can imagine how hard it would be for for me by myself.
Well, the New York Times sort of has a name, and people kind of gravitate
Kinda.
towards it.
Yeah, and it worked out very well for them.
Yeah. 21 hats. I'm not sure everyone, it's not like a household name.
Not yet. But luckily or happily, I think people get the idea behind it. It's kind of what we were talking about before. Nobody's completely prepared to do all the things you have to do to build a business. We're here to help. You probably can wear a few of those hats comfortably. Maybe there's some you can't. And we're hoping to create a community that helps with all of that.
Yeah, I've used the hat rack as a metaphor for a zillion years. And, as business owners, we have to put on different hats. Sometimes every 10 minutes, but usually about every half an hour, 45 minutes. You have to go from, being a customer service person to being a salesperson to being the marketing manager to being the logistics person. And until you have employees that can do that stuff, you have to learn how to do it yourself.
Which is a great experience. I mean, it's good to dabble in all of that. No one can be good at all of it, but it's good to at least know how it works so that you can manage someone when you do get to the point where you can hire someone to do it.
Yeah, well, you have to become at least adequate. Otherwise, your business is not going to last.
Right. Or you're never going to get to that point where you hire those employees you're talking about.
Right. Yeah, and it's important to hire somebody who actually knows more about that subject than you do. But they also have to have, and this is really important in my opinion, they have to share the same value system you have. Without that, you're just not going to have success because you're going to be fighting values and not working on a common interest of moving the business forward.
It is interesting. Things have changed in recent years. Businesses can go a lot longer without hiring employees now, and they can outsource a lot. You then get into the, like it could be about marketing, for example. You then get into the question of, how would I do better? Am I better off if I bring somebody in and they really understand how the business works and they work for me full time? Or am I better off going to somebody who does this all the time and has lots of experience working in a lot of different companies and tell them what I need and tap their expertise? I'm not sure there's a right or wrong answer to that. It's a tricky challenge.
There's actually a middle ground to that, which is, you actually hire part-time people who may not be world-class, but they're very cost-effective. And you have to put some time in coaching and teaching them how to become what they are. But, the thing that I've learned by using virtual assistants as well as people in our office is it's still a values-based hire. If I don't, when we hire virtual assistants, we have an interview where we talk about values. And I don't say, how do you feel about personal responsibility? I'll ask them an open-ended question that will allow them to expound upon that a bit. So I get a sense of whether they actually show personal responsibility or they don't. And if they don't, I can't hire them. I don't care if they're sitting in an office next to me or they're in the Philippines.
That makes perfect sense to me.
Yeah. So it's something that's really important, that I think. Loren, we are unfortunately out of time, as I'm looking at our clock that's gone there.
That went quickly.
Well, it usually does, unfortunately, especially when you have somebody as good as guest as you. So I am sure that people are going to want to find 21 Hats. They're going to want to find your podcast. They're going to find all that great daily newsletter that you send out. So how do they do that?
They can find it all if they go to 21hats.com. That's the number one, hats.com. They can find the podcast, the 21 Hats podcast, wherever they find podcasts. We do publish them on the 21hats.com site with a transcript, but it's also available through Apple and Google and wherever else you get podcasts.
Cool. And I've got two things I would like you to do. The first, I've been asking for almost 7 years now that this podcast has been going on, which is go to wherever you're listening to this podcast. It could be Apple, it could be Spotify, it could be Amazon. We're on all those places. And please, please, please leave us an honest rating and review. If you love us, 5 stars is nice. If you hate us, well, I hope you don't, but you may. And you have to talk about that too. So it's important that you do one of those things. Could be someplace in the middle too. Who knows? At any rate, go and rate us, rate and review us. It's important. And while you're at it, subscribe if you like us.
How could somebody hate you, Josh? That's not possible.
Oh, it's really possible.
I don't see it, but I'll take your word for it.
Okay, you've never been on the receiving end of one of my little blasts I do. The second thing I want you to do, and again, this would help me a lot, and I think you get some value from it. I just published my second book about 7 weeks ago. It's called The Sale Ready Company, and it continues the story of our friendly aardvark family as they're going through, and John's getting ready to transition out of his business, and that provides all sorts of issues for he and his family. It's an awful fun read. Even people who don't own businesses have told me, when's the third book coming out? I want to know what happened. You may too. It's really easy to get. I'm actually selling for half price on our website right now, which is www.salereadycompany.com. That's www.salereadycompany.com. And with it, you'll get a bunch of bonuses, and you can even have a free 20-minute conversation with me if you have a particular issue you'd like to talk to. So this is Josh Patrick. We're with Loren Feldman. You're at Cracking the Cash Flow Code. Thanks a lot for stopping by. I hope to see you back here really soon.
Thanks, Josh.
Yeah, this was